Yo, what's up everyone? Welcome to today's video. We're going to be talking about the Japan exclusive Nintendo games Iceberg. Now, if you're unfamiliar with the Iceberg series, it's a giant list essentially, with the top layer being the most obvious and mainstream things. And as you go down the layers of the iceberg, it becomes more niche and more obscure. So today's list I just randomly found on Reddit. It was made by user Amazing Andrew47, so thank you very much for that. So this isn't like a super end-all be-all complete list of games. I just picked it because I just thought it was an interesting variety of games and stuff that we can talk about. And since the list is a couple of years old, some of these games actually have come out in the West at this point. For example, Kid Dracula has been released a couple years ago in the Castlevania collection. So without further ado, let's dive right in and see what this list is going to bring us. Pokemon Red and Green. The original two Pokemon games that started the franchise. While we did get these games in the form of Pokemon Red and Blue in the West, there are notable differences to these versions. Most noticeably, the green version had a lot of green colors being used throughout the game. Other notable differences are the roster, different Pokemon sprites, and even dialogue tweaks. Though we did get a remastered version for the Game Boy Advance in the form of Fire Red and Leaf Green, these two Game Boy versions of the game still remain unreleased in the West. Mothered 3 for the Game Boy Advance, the much anticipated third installment in the Mother series. A unique RPG set in sort of a rural America type setting. Mother, the original game, was never really released in the West up until way later when we got it on the Virtual Console. We did get Mother 2 in the form of Earthbound, but due to poor sales and just a lack of popularity at the time, we never really got its sequel, Mother 3. The many Fire Emblem games. The Fire Emblem series, which is a series of RPGs, started on the Famicom with Shadow Dragon and the Blade of Light in 1990. As of the recording of this video, the series currently consists of 17 core entries, of which the 7th game, The Blazing Blade, debuted in the West under the title Fire Emblem, making that the first official Fire Emblem game released in the West. While the original Famicom game never really got a Western release on the NES, it was ported to the Switch pretty recently, with a full English translation. Animal Forest. Known in Japan as Dobutsu no Mori or Animal Forest, the Animal Crossing series debuted in the West on the GameCube. In Japan, however, the game started as a Nintendo 64 game. Because the game's release date was so close to the GameCube already being out at the time, it also got a simultaneous GameCube release. Because Nintendo in the West already kind of stopped shipping N64 games, we only got this GameCube version. At its core, the N64 version is pretty similar to the GameCube one, but the GameCube version adds a lot, like Game Boy Advance connectivity and a bunch of extras in the game that there wasn't any room for on the N64 card. Neon Genesis Evangelion. Evangelion is a very popular mecha anime television series. It was directed by Hideaki Anno. Due to its popularity, it also has a lot of video games based on it. These games were released for a lot of platforms, and they range from strategy games to even visual novels and dating sims. But for the sake of consistency, I'm going to keep it to the Nintendo games. My favorite is Neon Genesis Evangelion for the N64, a combat RPG game that uses multiple voice clips and images from the TV show. Probably due to translation and dubbing issues, this game never got a Western release. Shin Megami Tensei. Shin Megami Tensei is a giant internationally known media franchise consisting of anime, manga, and most importantly, video games, of which the first installment was Digital Devil Story Megami Tensei, which is an RPG for the Famicom made by Namco. Today, the series is mostly known for its Persona spin-off, which has grown so big that it even has its own spin-offs, like a really popular fighting game. While these days, most if not all of these games are making it out to the West, the original Shin Megami Tensei for the Famicom remains a Japanese exclusive. Paneru de Pong. Paneru de Pong, or Puzzle League, is a series of puzzle games that first began on the Super Nintendo as Paneru de Pong or Tetris Attack in North America. The game has been released on a variety of consoles, but the core gameplay is usually the same, though the presentation might be different, featuring different Nintendo characters or none entirely. Mario and Wario. Developed by Game Freak, the same company that made Pokemon, Mario & Wario was a game for the Super Famicom where Mario had placed a bucket over Mario's head and you control a little angel using the Super Famicom mouse where you had to clear a path and avoid obstacles so that a blinded Mario can automatically find its way to the end of the level. Though there are fan translations, as of the recording of this video, there has not been a Western release for this game. Donkey Konga 3. The third installment of the Donkey Konga series, called Donkey Konga 3 Tabehodai Haru Magitate Goju Kyoku, meaning all you can eat 50 freshly picked spring songs. It's a rhythm game that you can play using the Donkey Kong bongos on the GameCube. This game was probably never released outside of Japan due to its large list of J-pop and anime songs that were mostly unknown in the West at the time. Clock Tower. Clock Tower is a survival horror point-and-click adventure game series created by Hifumi Kono, and the first installment was released for the Super Famicom in 1995. Developed by Human Entertainment, it was originally a small-budget experimental project and is kind of considered a pioneer within the genre. Though the second installment, Clock Tower 2 The Struggle Within, was released in North America for the PlayStation, the original installment has to this date not been released outside of Japan, though as most Super Famicom games on this list, there are fan translations out there. Densetsu no Starfy. Densetsu no Starfy is the first installment in the legendary Starfy series. It's a platformer for the Game Boy Advance and was originally planned to be released in Japan and China, though the Chinese version was cancelled. The series has 3 installments for the Game Boy Advance and 2 for the Nintendo DS, but only the second Nintendo DS title was released outside of Japan, named simply The Legendary Starfy. It was originally developed for the Game Boy Color, but as the release date was closer to the Game Boy Advance's release date, it got released on that platform instead. Just Dance for the Wii. Just Dance on the Wii is the first official home console version of Just Dance on the Japanese market. This one and its sequel, Just Dance Wii 2, are considered Japanese exclusive due to their exclusive song list specifically catered for the Japanese market. Kirby's Super Star Stacker. Kirby's Super Star Stacker is a puzzle game for the Game Boy, and it's also very hard to pronounce 3 times in a row. Originally for the Game Boy, it also came out for the Super Famicom in Japan as Kabi no Kira Kira Kids, or Kirby's Sparkling Kids. While the Game Boy version has been released in Japan, North America, and even Europe, the Super Famicom version was never released in the West due to its release date of 1997, which is when Nintendo of America stopped shipping Super Nintendo games. F-Zero X Expansion Kit. F-Zero X is the sequel to the Super Nintendo racing game F-Zero. While the game was fully localized for America and Europe, it had an expansion kit for the Nintendo 64 disk drive. The expansion kit featured 12 new tracks, a machine creator, a course editor, and new stereophonic soundtrack. In addition to these new cups, players can create a custom cup, and the disc could save up to 100 tracks and up to 3 ghost data per course. Since the Nintendo 64 disk drive, or 64DD, never came out in the West, this remains a Japanese exclusive. Itadaki Street DS. Developed by Square Enix, Itadaki Street DS is a Monopoly-like board game for the Nintendo DS. It kinda has a similar feel to Mario Party. It features characters from the Super Mario franchise and the Dragon Quest series, summing up to a total of 23 playable characters. It also had 14 playable stages, or boards, consisting of Mario stages like Yoshi's Island, Bowser's Castle, Mario's Circuit, and Dragon Quest stages like Castle Trodaine, Colossus, Ghost Ship, or Mount Magmageddon. My guess as to why this one didn't make it overseas is that Dragon Quest just isn't that big of a franchise in the West and Nintendo just didn't think it was worth it. But then again, the sequel Fortune Street for the Wii did make it to the West. Captain Rainbow. Captain Rainbow is an action-adventure game for the Wii. The game is about protagonist Nick, who's able to transform into Captain Rainbow and has a yo-yo. The game has a unique combination of adventuring around the island where Nick can go fishing, buck catching, and help other islanders with their requests through various mini-games, and the action part where Nick transforms into Captain Rainbow. Because the game just didn't sell very well in Japan, it was never localized or released in the West. color-changing Tingle's Love Balloon Trip. Known in Japan as Irozuki Chinkuru no Koi no Balloon Trip, a sequel to freshly picked Tingle's Rosy Rupee Land, it's a mini-game puzzle-type game that's a spin-off focusing on Tingle, a character from the Legend of Zelda series. While the first game in this series released in Japan and Europe, this one didn't make it overseas. Adventure Island 4. Known in Japan as Takahashi Meijin no Bokenjima number 4 for the Famicom, and also viewable in my previous video here where I actually met Mr. Takahashi Meijin. This sequel to the legendary Adventure Island series is less of a platformer and more of a action-adventure type platformer. This game was released 4 years after the Super Nintendo already came out, and they just didn't care enough to localize it in the West. Due to its late release date and low production numbers, this is one of the rarest and most expensive Famicom games you can get these days. If you're a fan of Mr. Takahashi or Adventure Island in general, I highly recommend you check a fan translation out of this one. It's really good. Kid Dracula. Known in Japanese as Akumajo Special Boku Dracula-kun, it's a platform game for the Famicom. While not necessarily a spin-off, it is considered a parody of the Castlevania series, who follows Kid Dracula in his adventures in a Castlevania-type game. The game didn't really get a Western release until way later when the PS4, Xbox One, Nintendo Switch, and Microsoft Windows version of Castlevania Anniversary Collection included it with a English localization where it was officially named Kid Dracula. Tetris 64. Released in Japan for the Nintendo 64, Tetris 64 is a version of Tetris that is the only game for the N64 that uses the biosensor, which was bundled with the game. This was literally a heart rate monitor that the player would clip onto their ear, where it would measure the heart rate and adjust the game's difficulty accordingly. I can see why this one never made it to the West, seeing as a whole new peripheral would have been just way too much. But it's really interesting to see how they were experimenting with stuff like this at the time. SimCity 64. A unique version of SimCity specifically made for the Nintendo 64. It's kind of a sequel to the Super Nintendo version, and it was exclusively made for the N64 disk drive. Just like with the F-Zero expansion pack, the N64 disk drive never made it to the West, so neither did this game. F-Zero Climax. Officially the last F-Zero installment for the next 19 years, after which we finally got F-Zero 99 for the Switch, which I guess technically counts as a new F-Zero game. F-Zero Climax is one of those games that also just never left Japan. It's sort of a sequel to F-Zero GP, and I guess they just didn't think we needed another one after that game. F-Zero Climax carries most of the features over from GP Legend, but it also has a edit mode where you can create your own tracks. I recommend trying this one. It's a fun little F-Zero game if you're a fan of the series, and it has a fan translation as well. Kirby's Toy Box Baseball. Kirby's Toy Box is a Kirby spin-off series that has a bunch of entries like Kirby Spinball, Star Break, Round and Round, Cannonball, Pachinko, Ball Rally. It's a fun little baseball game for the Super Famicom where Kirby is the ball. It was released for the Super Famicom through the Satellaview. This was an online streaming service that would stream games through Japanese satellite networks directly through a special cartridge and add-on for your Super Famicom. A lot of these games were timed events where they actually had a stream of voice data to combine with the games itself, where you could have narrations and other extra features. Tomodachi Collection. Tomodachi Collection is known as a social simulation game for the Nintendo DS, and the whole game is consisted of user-created Miis. The players could import them from the Wii to their DS if they had an internet connection, or make new ones using the in-game Mii creator. These Miis would then interact with each other, form relationships, you can give them Mii clothes, food, and all that kind of stuff. It was pretty rare for these kind of experimental games to make it overseas, so we didn't get this one, but we did get the sequel to it called My Tomodachi Life for the 3DS, and I remember that one being really fun. Puzzle and Dragons, Super Mario Bros. Edition. The Puzzle and Dragon games are kind of a mix between role-playing and puzzle games. I guess that was obvious based on the name. This game was originally released in Japan as an exclusive. However, later it was announced on a Nintendo Direct that this game would get an international release. in the form of a premium version bundled together with Puzzle and Dragon Z, but the original version of Puzzle and Dragon Super Mario Edition by itself never got an international release, therefore it's on the list. Bomberman 64. Not to be confused with the 1997 release of Bomberman 64, this 2001 Japanese release of Bomberman 64, it's entirely in 2D, and you know what that means. If it's not 3D and released in this era of gaming, we did not want it in the West. Therefore, this is a Japanese exclusive version of Bomberman 64. Bomberman 64 as we know it in the West was actually released in Japan as Baku Bomberman, which has its own sequel, and then there's Bomberman Heroes, and it's a whole different thing. The 2001 Japanese release of Bomberman 64 is actually the very last N64 game released in Japan. Have you ever... And Kensaku. Actually co-developed by Google, this minigame compilation has players attempt to predict the number of search results of terms on Google. There's 14 different minigames in total. The game is presented by a robot called Ando Kensaku, which is kind of a play on words with the Japanese name Ando and is a more accurate way of pronouncing the title, but anyway. It needed to be connected to the internet and actually used Google's search engine for the game itself, which it's really cool. I think translating this whole thing would have just been a bit too much and too experimental, so yeah, this one never came out in the West. Pokemon Battlerio. Pokemon Battlerio is a Japanese exclusive arcade game. In the game, you battle Pokemon using these little pucks, and you put the pucks on the reader and they would summon Pokemon and items and all kinds of stuff. You get a new randomized puck every time you start a game, which costs 100 yen. This was about $1 at the time of release in 2007. And since you get like a physical thing every time you play this game, and some of them were rare, you can see the collectability and people would really go crazy for these things. This was never released in the West like at all because it's not even on consoles, it's just an arcade game. And in Japan, arcades are still a thing. They're still kind of big, especially in 2007, so there was a huge scene for this kind of stuff. While this particular arcade machine is discontinued, it's still around in the form of Pokemon Mesastar, which I guess is sort of a sequel to this. And in Japan, these are mostly regarded as kids' games. I've never walked past one and seen like an actual adult playing these things. If you're in Japan and you want to find them, they're mostly located around Pokemon centers, but there usually is a specific little space in arcades for these. Custom Robo and Custom Robo V2. Custom Robo and Custom Robo V2 were the first two installments in the Custom Robo franchise, which is a action role-playing game series. The basics of the game is that there's an arena where you kind of fight and battle, but you can customize your robots with different body parts, guns, bombs, and pods. And there's also a pretty deep story mode where it's kind of an RPG that you're a player that's getting into this franchise. It's pretty cool. I only got into this franchise pretty recently. And the DS version, Custom Robo Arena, was released in the West, but these first N64 titles we never got. Chibi Robo New Play Control re-release. The New Play Control series is a series of titles where Nintendo ported GameCube games to the Wii. A lot of these games had enhancements such as widescreen support, enhanced graphics, and even Wiimote and Nunchuck support. So while we did get Chibi Robo for the GameCube, which was a really fun game, this enhanced version never made it to the West, which makes it a Japanese exclusive. The Luigi's Mansion arcade game. Now, as I mentioned before, Japan still has a very active arcade scene. And even though Sega recently sold all of its arcade, they're still there, they're just under a different name. So while not as big as it once was, Japan still has a very thriving arcade scene. And within that, Nintendo actually releases a lot of arcade games. And they partner up with companies like Capcom or Konami or Namco for the hardware for these things, which brought us Luigi's Mansion Arcade. It's pretty fun. You have an actual vacuum in the thing, and it's just really good arcade joy. To this day, this game is still widely played. It came out in 2015, but you can still find them all over Japan. But like most, if not all of these Nintendo exclusive arcade games, they're never released outside of Japan. Tingle's Balloon Fight DS. This was a Club Nintendo exclusive that was only released in Japan. It was a bonus game, and it was based on the old Balloon Fight, but it had Tingle, the side character from Zelda. Again, one of those things that never made it out in the West. Pokemon Breeder Mini. In Japanese known as Pokemon Sodateyasan Mini, or Pokemon Daycare Man Mini, was a game for the Pokemon Mini, which was a tiny little handheld that had cartridges with minigames. In the game, you care for a young Torchic, Trico, or Mudkip. And it's essentially like a Tamagotchi where you just care for the game, you feed it, you play games with it, you have mini games. The difference here is where the games actually have an end, where if you complete one of the 4 different skill categories, the game is ended, and you can deliver your Pokemon to a new owner. Again, like all of the games on this list, this one stayed in Japan. I think mostly because of the Pokemon Mini in itself just wasn't that popular in the West. Bit Generations, Colorus, and Orbital. The Bit Generation series was a series of games featuring super simple controls, graphics, and gameplay. They were all originally released for the Game Boy Advance and only in Japan. In fact, most of them were only released through Club Nintendo. It's only later that these games got re-releases for the WiiWare and DSiWare. While it wasn't officially announced, a lot of these games, in fact mostly all of them, were also released on the Western versions of the DSiWare and WiiWare shops. All of them except 2, Colorus and Orbital. These 2 games were never released outside of Japan. In Colorus, you eliminate the colored squares by changing the color of the squares around them. And in Orbital, the player controls a star that kind of grows by colliding it with other stars. Now, Orbital actually got a remake of the original game, which was released in the West as Orbient for the WiiWare, but the original version of Orbital has never seen an official release outside of Japan. Barcode Boy. The Barcode Boy is a peripheral for the Game Boy, the original Game Boy, and it lets you scan and read barcodes. Games such as Monster Maker Barcode Saga were designed to use it, where the player would scan these barcode cards that you would get for the game, which would give you in-game items and other customizations. It was way ahead of its time. It's kind of like the e-reader for the Game Boy Advance, but that one did get an international release. The game was actually featured in an issue of Nintendo Power magazine, but never came out in the West. Excitebike, Boon Boon Mario Battle Stadium. Boon Boon Mario Battle is a remake of Excitebike for the Famicom or NES. It was released for the Super Famicom through the Satellaview. As mentioned before, the Satellaview was an add-on for the Super Famicom where you could acquire games through Japan's satellite network, the same network where we get our TV from, the BSNCS system. Again, like we mentioned before, some of these games would only be able to be downloaded at a certain point in time, and as a result, Boon Boon Mario Battle Stadium was only available through certain dates in 1997. If you were too late, you wouldn't get the game. Furthermore, the game was released in installments. There was Battle Stadium 1, 2, 3, and 4, each iteration adding new characters to the game. So with this game not even being really released in Japan outside of the Satellaview, there are, however, scans of the promotion material and ROMs have been dumped. Clu Clu Land. Welcome to New Clu Clu Land. Welcome to New Clu Clu Land was the Versus arcade version of Clu Clu Land. It was released for the Famicom Disk System and never really got a Western release. It was, however, available in America and Europe as a unlockable NES game in Animal Crossing for the GameCube, where it was known as Clu Clu Land D, with the D standing for disc. It actually featured new difficulty modes and a boss named Unira, which wasn't in the original one. Welcome home, Chibi Robo, Happy Big Rich Sweep. Known in Japan as Okairi Chibi Robo Hapirichi Osoji, is a DS game revolving around Chibi Robo, who is helping a grown Jenny Sanderson from the original Chibi Robo game, making this sort of a sequel. As of the recording of this video, this game has never been released in the West. Alright, there you have it. That was a lot of fun. It was quite the list. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Thank you guys so much for sticking around all the way till the end. And yeah, let me know if there's anything that I missed. Let me know if there's any games I should have added. And especially if you guys want to see me do this again, be sure to join the Discord and drop some suggestions of lists or icebergs or whatever that you want me to cover. I had a lot of fun making this. I actually learned a lot as well while researching all of these subjects. So hit the like button if you liked the video. Hit the dislike button if you disliked it. And as always, thank you guys so very much for watching. And I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.